Please pray with me. Startle us, O God, with your word. Silence in us any voice but your own, and may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. Growing up, I distinctly remember my mom saying to me, "If I say no to you once, I mean it for good, so don't bother asking me again." That was to discourage a younger, more persistent me from asking about sleeping over at my best friend's house over and over again, as she and I were prone to do on any given weekend. I learned early on through her and through the society that we lived in that it was rude to bother or pester people into getting my way. And I know I'm not alone in this because Sharon R. Blizzard, a pastor and commentator, says, "I grew up in a culture where it was considered poor form and impolite to bother or pester someone. Children were seen, not heard. Adults were civil, or worse yet, nice, a word laden with baggage in the South. And folks who either made a stink or raised a ruckus were highly suspect, and sometimes even the objects of outright ridicule. If you follow the rules, keep your composure, and do what's right, the hope is that everything will turn out okay. And if it doesn't, well, you aren't supposed to do too much grousing because, after all, no one ever said life was fair." Anyone else resonate with this kind of upbringing? It values being polite over being honest, being long-suffering over making demands, and being compliant over being stubborn. And sometimes I think our own faith culture, this thing we call Christianity, has somehow morphed and changed to value being nice over anything else. Anyone else ascribe to the gospel of niceness? You know its credo: don't stir the pot, don't cause trouble, and above all else, be nice. One writer says it like this, framing it as, "Many Christians believe that the highest calling God has placed on us is to be nice." These Christians are wrong, he continues. God has not called us to be nice. Rather, God has called us to be good. Yeah. This baptized baby knows what he's talking about. Here's the difference. Nice people never confront evil. Good people do. Nice people are weak. Good people are strong. Jesus wasn't nice. He was kind. He was compassionate. He was caring. But he was unbending and unflinching when it came to standing up for truth and justice, and it cost him his life. Friends, the gospel of nice might feel good for us, and it might be safe, but that's not the faith of Jesus' followers. That's the faith of the empire, trying to use religion to exercise control over people. Because let's face it, Jesus wasn't always nice, always loving, yes, but not always nice. One of my favorite memes on the internet shows a picture of Jesus overturning tables at the temple. And it reads, "If someone asks, what would Jesus do? Remind them that turning over tables and chasing people with whips is within the realm of possibility." And this morning, we hear Jesus lifting up as an example for his disciples someone who didn't turn over tables, but who pestered and nagged and annoyed someone so much that he eventually gave in, just to be free of her persistence. As Reverend Blizzard writes, in the story of the unjust judge and persistent widow, Jesus seems to be saying to avoid the route of asking nicely and then just waiting to see whether that gets results. Advocating for justice is messy work and a process that can be long, wearisome, and frustrating. Yet we are not to lose heart, but rather to keep on praying, pestering, and persevering. Our faith is not about being nice. It's about love, and the kind of agape love that demands justice so that all may flourish. Amy Jill Levine is a New Testament scholar who is also Jewish, and she points out that the common translation of what constitutes the judge's motivation for justice doesn't quite capture it. She writes, the NRSV's mild suggestion that the widow will, quote, wear out the judge is another taming of the widow. The Greek actually uses a boxing term. The judge is concerned that the widow will give him a black eye. The widow is not only outspoken, she is in your face, unrelenting, and seemingly even on the cusp of belligerent. This is the persistence and pestering of a woman who is left with no other options but to try and try again. Now, widows in Jesus' day lacked status, power, and privilege. They had no voice in the public sphere. And in Luke, we see widows certainly as those on the margins of society. But Luke also portrays widows as prophets, as those who can show us how and who we are to be. Nita Stamper notes that in addition to being vulnerable, widows also appear as prophetic, active, and faithful. Certainly the widow who gives her last coin is not only vulnerable, but also a model of faithful generosity. The first widow in the Gospel of Luke is Anna, a prophet who spreads the good news of Jesus' birth. Jesus, in his inaugural sermon at Nazareth, mentions the widow of Zarephath, who feeds Elijah from her meager supplies in a famine, and whose son is returned to life by the prophet. All of these widows appear only in the Gospel of Luke, including the widow of our current parable, who is persistent, active, and forceful enough to get the justice she demands eventually from an utterly unjust judge. This parable shows us today that those on the margins and without power, those who have nothing to lose and everything to gain, can be for us an example of how to faithfully live as God's people in the world. Now, most of us, including me, have a lot more to lose than the widow did when we stand up against unjust policies, politicians, powers, and principalities. Most of us worry about saving face, being liked, and being included. And we are often afraid to speak up or to speak out too loudly because we don't want to lose the status and privilege we have built up. As a people, as a society, we have been conditioned this way. But that is why following Jesus is so countercultural and revolutionary. And that's why it is so important for us to stay connected and to stand in solidarity with those in our society who are being oppressed, who are being pushed to the margins, and who are being silenced. Because that is exactly where Jesus told us to look in order to know how we might live. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, we shouldn't be getting our cues from the most powerful in the room, but from the most vulnerable and marginalized in the room. This week, we lost Representative Elijah Cummings, who was a representative from Baltimore. I will miss his voice in Congress. As a politician, he held great power, but he never forgot from whence he came, and he was committed to listening to the voices of the most vulnerable in his district. He once said, "My life is based on pain, passion, and purpose." Pain, passion, and purpose. That, to me, is the life's work of all of us, to intimately know pain by willingly standing with those who suffer, to be passionate about creating justice for all, and to work tirelessly towards that purpose. In that way, Representative Cummings was very much like this widow, persistent and nagging and speaking up again and again. So what about us? Are we like this widow, willing to give everything else up for the pursuit of justice, relentlessly advocating for what is due, persevering day in and day out for equity, creating holy trouble and raising a ruckus, determined to wear down all that opposes God's will for God's people on earth? Or are we more like Jesus' disciples, much too often were, failing to follow through with the simplest of requests, willing to go with the flow and acquiesce to the powers that be, meekly and passively allowing injustices to take place right in front of our noses while upholding status quo and remaining silent? Jesus says, be like the persistent widow. In spite of everything, in the face of adversity and rejection, nevertheless to persist. I think many of us probably can see some of ourselves in the widow, but I wonder if we as a society are sometimes more like the unjust judge. Not because we neither fear God nor respect people, but because in our day-to-day lives, the cries of those who are suffering the most often go so easily ignored. It's not that we don't care. It's that there are so many voices crying out so frequently that we have become accustomed to the amount of trauma and pain in the world. It's become background noise. The things that used to shock us are now commonplace, expected even, and while we still believe they are unacceptable, they are certainly no longer surprising. Take immigration detention, or the separation of families, or the bans on those from certain Muslim countries, or the water crisis in Flint. These are all horrible and awful things, we would all agree, but somehow over the course of time, they've become conditions of how we live rather than a crisis to be addressed immediately. That's what's so frightening for me. How easily we can be accustomed to unjust conditions, how quickly we go from outcries to silence. Dr. Raj Nadella of Columbia Theological Seminary was a panelist at the Co-Inspire conference that I attended last week. And he lifted up this very phenomenon for the conference as he reflected on the story of Ezekiel in the Valley of Bones. He noted that most people, when they wake up in a valley of bones, would freak out. If you or I ended up in a valley surrounded by bones, we would not be okay. But for Ezekiel, death and destruction had become so commonplace that he's no longer fazed by it. He walks around this valley, calm and collected, having a conversation with God, and that is the tendency, perhaps even the need for us as humans. We learn to live with and become complacent to that which should provoke an uproar. Things that once caused pain and shock slowly become a way of life. And so perhaps today's parable is for us that persistent widow that cannot be ignored. Perhaps it is just the wake-up call that we need to be shaken from our complacency. Perhaps it is the pestering disturbance we are forced to hear so that we might be moved to action and justice once again. What have we accepted as merely the way of things these days? And what must we do to stand with the widow and demand justice yet again? This is what God's word can do for us if we are open enough to the Spirit's moving. Our greatest hope from today's word is this, I believe, that God is not like the unjust judge. God hears and honors our perseverance for justice. And not only that, God is with us when we choose to be annoying and pestering in our demands for justice. In fact, God's Spirit is what spurs us to be so reckless and outspoken in the face of power and to push back. God is with the oppressed. So when we stand with those who are oppressed, we work alongside a God who also works tirelessly for justice. We are not alone, and through God, justice shall prevail. But not if we stand idly by. We must speak up, be loud, be obnoxious. We're giving you permission. We must disrupt, challenge, and confront. That is Jesus' call to us in this parable. And God's promise to us in all of this is that God is with us. So go and be the widow. Refuse to be the judge, and know that God is with us in our persistence. Thanks be to God. Amen.